And you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Reuters has a piece by Luke Cohen entitled Analysis Beyond Yachts and Planes, U.S. Turns to Foreign Agent Laws to Curb Russian Influence. In 5 months since the U.S. Department of Justice launched a task force to seize Russian oligarchs' assets to pressure Moscow over its invasion of Ukraine, prosecutors also have targeted something less tangible, Russia's influence. Well, what is the government really targeting? Influence or a different narrative based in fact? For insight, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So Cohen continues, the Justice Department has broadly ramped up enforcement of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, or FARA, and a related law known by its code number 951. Dr. Horne, to me, what we're really seeing here is not spy hunting, but narrative and truth squashing, and the government is using very powerful and dangerous tools to squash the dissemination of valid information. It's almost like a nuclear info war. Your thoughts, sir?
Well, as we both know, the subtext of our discussion is what unfolded in St. Louis, Missouri, and St. Petersburg, Florida, just a few days ago, when the African People's Socialist Party and their affiliate, the Uhuru Movement, were routed and rousted in the dark days of the dark time of the morning with drones, with battering rams, with flash grenades, with handcuffs, even though they were not charged with crimes, although they are supposedly tied to sources and forces in Moscow. And I think it's important for us to recognize that going forward, it will not be accidental if black people in particular are being subjected to this kind of harassment, because we recognize that approximately 70-odd years ago, when W.E.B. Du Bois, the father of Pan-Africanism, a founder of the NAACP, when he was 83 years old in 1951, he was put on trial, handcuffed, and barely escaped spending his declining years in prison, precisely because it was said in federal court that he was the agent of a foreign power. That is to say that he was an agent of Moscow. Why? Because he thought that nuclear weapons should be abolished and banned and outlawed, and Moscow thought that nuclear weapons should be banished, outlawed, and banned, and therefore, ipso facto, that meant that Dr. Du Bois was an agent of Moscow. Now, we're seeing a recrudescence of those bad old days, and I think it's more important than ever for you to get your crack news team on the case, on the story, and solicit opinions from the Congressional Black Caucus, from the NAACP leadership, from Reverend Al Sharpton, with regard specifically to their opinion on what happened to the African People's Socialist Party, because I dare say that what the U.S. government is attempting as we speak is trying to restrict and constrict ideological space. And whenever that happens, that's bad news for this oppressed community, speaking of the Black American community. And I should also say that one of the reasons why the Black American community will be particularly susceptible to this kind of outrage is that there is a structural flaw in U.S. culture and society that's barely acknowledged and recognized. That structural flaw being that the United States was basically founded as a white supremacist state with the idea that Africans would be enslaved forevermore. By dint of changes in the international climate and our own militant and fierce struggle, we were able to change that particular noxious equation, but still hanging fire is this idea that this enslaved population and therefore their descendants will continue to ally with the real and imagined antagonists of Washington in order to gain a measure of freedom. And certainly there is evidence to suggest that that is the case. We've talked on these airwaves more than once about what happened in August 1814 when the Redcoats invaded Washington, D.C., assisted by enslaved Africans, torched the town, sent James Madison and his garrulous spouse, Dolly, fleeing into the streets one step ahead of the posse, and then the black Americans getting on British ships and sailing to freedom in Trinidad and Tobago. You basically had a replay of that particular scenario ever since. And I'm afraid to say that even though there are those in our community and in our leadership who may be unfamiliar with this history, I guarantee you that at the highest reaches of the Justice Department and the White House, they are certainly familiar with this history, and they do not want to see a replay of August 1814.
Dr. Horne, another thing I'd like to get you to comment on is the issue of the concept. There's like a foundational racist concept here, and it's that, Black people have an intellectual inferiority, and it stops us from understanding our issues and advocating against any oppression or things that we feel are unfair. Therefore, here's the term that comes in: outside agitators. Whether it's Bull Connor saying there's outside agitators from the North, or now, whether it's the Biden administration or the FBI, forget what administration it is, saying there's outside agitators from Russia or whatever, it gets back to Black people aren't smart enough to understand and advocate. And if not for some white puppeteer from, in this instance, Russia, they wouldn't be saying that things aren't so great for them and they have to push back. Dr. Horne.
Well, that's obviously a fictional conceit. On the one hand, it's designed to throw dust in the eyes of our community, to make our community feel inferior, to make our community feel that it does not understand the lessons of history. And on the other hand, it's a kind of comfort food for the U.S. ruling elite, because if they can convince themselves that Black people are not able to see that they're being mistreated, then perhaps Black people will not see that they're being mistreated, and therefore the elites can sleep well at night, as opposed to the times of slavery when many of them had to sleep with one eye open for fear of an enslaved person sneaking into the bedroom and cutting them a new smile from one side of their throat to the other. And so we really need to disabuse ourselves of those sorts of fictional conceits, because they never held water. They certainly hold little or no water today. And all it really serves to do is create a more confused situation than would otherwise exist.
You mentioned some of the other organizations that we need to hear from. You mentioned the NAACP and you mentioned some others. And as you were going through that list, it made me think, well, we won't hear from them if we have, for example, Karen Bass sitting on the board of the National Endowment for Democracy. We've got Bakari Sellers carrying the water for the Urban Empowerment Action PAC. We've got Hakeem Jeffries carrying the water for Team Blue. We got Gregory Meeks putting through legislation condemning African countries for defending themselves on the international stage. So we've got all of these individuals that are supposed to be kinfolk, but as they say, our skinfolk ain't always our kinfolk, not really operating in the best interest, really, of democracy.
Well, I understand your point. I take your point. But in my estimation, it really argues for even more pressure on these forces, because there are many in our community who are well aware of what's going on. They're well aware of the fact that Bakari Sellers in Detroit was campaigning against our interests, that he was on all fours with the Israeli lobby, I'm afraid to say. But I think there are also people in our community who recognize the danger and peril we all face because of the constriction and restriction of ideological space. We find that U.S. imperialism has stumbled into a real dilemma. On the one hand, it has negative relations with Moscow. On the other, in light of the trip of Nancy Pelosi to Taiwan, relations with the People's Republic of China are headed south. We already see that reflected in terms of the People's Bank of China not buying as many U.S. Treasury bills, which, if they continue on that pace, will force Washington to raise taxes in order to keep the U.S. government afloat. We see that China is going to be curtailing commodity purchases of soybeans from Midwestern farmers, which could have negative impact on Mr. Biden in the midterm congressional elections. And so the stakes are rather grim right now. And I did not even mention the fact that Washington is apparently aware of this dilemma, which is one of the reasons why they sent Iran nuclear negotiator Robert Malley jetting across the Atlantic to Vienna to resume talks with the Iranians, because they did not want a three-cornered antagonist to face. That is to say, not only Moscow and Beijing, but Tehran at the same time, which, of course, are all grouped together as we speak in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And we all know that the Europeans are becoming ever more nervous about being yoked to the fate and whimsical fortunes of Washington, which is causing Germany to be faced with this dilemma of having many of their people freeze in the dark because of a curtailing of natural gas supplies and energy supplies from Moscow. So I think in light of the dire nature of the crisis that we face, there is no time like the present to pressure those individuals and organizations that you just mentioned, because if we don't get the captains at the wheel of this ship of fools to turn this vessel around, we're all going to be headed for that iceberg and perishing simultaneously.
Dr. Horne, another thing about going after Black activists in particular is that, and I think this is very dangerous, the Black, and I've used this word guardedly, struggle, the Black push for economic and social equality is portrayed as fundamentally un-American and can be disqualified, period. So now anyone who's standing up saying, perhaps things are unfair, that it's viewed, well, that's un-American. We better look into that. And I think that's very dangerous. Your thoughts?
And then you tie it to Russia, and that's a force multiplier.
Well, it certainly is. But once again, unless you understand the history of this country, you want to understand what Mr. Nixon just outlined. That is to say, routinely in this country, we are told that the so-called founding fathers, that their struggle was just, even though it led to massive bloodshed, even though fundamentally it was breaking the law, that is to say the law imposed by London, but that's celebrated every July 4th. But the folks who rule this country have difficulty in coming to grips with the fact that Black people's struggle should be saluted, because it, too, is seeking freedom and justice. But because of that conundrum that I mentioned a moment or two ago, that we were destined, according to these same fabled founding fathers, to be enslaved forevermore. And so, therefore, by its very nature, our struggle would be ruled and deemed illegitimate. Until we can crack that equation that I've just mentioned 2 seconds ago, I think we're always going to be faced with this dilemma of having people such as in the Uhuru movement and the African People's Socialist Party in St. Louis, Missouri, and St. Petersburg, Florida, being subjected to persecution and harassment, and really driven in many ways to the brink of death.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate that analysis. We look forward to having you back.